In this lecture, we're going to take a look at the history of the 7 Years' War. In particular, we're going to look at the causes and effects of the war and examine the ways in which the war changed world history. The 7 Years' War was a conflict with fronts in many parts of the globe, but the roots of the war were to be found in European politics. In part, the 7 Years' War was a struggle between the various dynastic powers. The Hanoverian English kings, for example, versus the Bourbon dynasty of the French and Spanish, and the Prussian Hohenzollern dynasty versus the Austrian Habsburgs. At the same time, a global colonial struggle between France and Britain also heated up and contributed to the outbreak of war. In this map, blue represents countries or territories aligned with the Allied powers of Great Britain, Prussia, and Portugal, and green represents countries or regions aligned with France, Spain, Austria, Russia, and Sweden, plus their allies. After the War of Austrian Succession from 1740 to 1748, in which Frederick the Great and Prussia attempted to contest the Austrian crown, Austria, France, and Russia formed an alliance against Prussia. Britain sided with Prussia to protect Hanover from France. Hanover in this map is located in red. You might be curious as to why Britain would be so concerned with the small region of modern-day Germany. At the time, the British kings were from the House of Hanover, and they had deep family ties to the Hanoverian crown in German territory. At the same time, a colonial struggle between France and Britain also heated up and contributed to the outbreak of war. The 7 Years' War was indeed a global conflict, and it is sometimes called by historians the First World War. In Europe, the main combatants were Britain and Prussia against France, Austria, and Russia. In the Indian subcontinent, the British and French allied with local rulers and also fought each other. In the Caribbean, the Spanish and French, both with monarchs from the House of Bourbon, fought the British. And finally, in North America, the 7 Years' War merged with what would become known as the French and Indian War, which actually started before the 7 Years' War, 1754 to 63, that war went. This was the British versus the French, and each side tried to woo as many Native American groups as possible to its cause. In 1756, summertime, about August, Frederick II's Prussian armies launched attacks against Saxony and Austria. In this map, Saxony is in red, while Austrian territories are in black. Frederick hoped to force his adversaries to sue for peace before another country could intervene on either one of their sides. Unfortunately, Frederick did not achieve a quick and decisive victory, and he faced a powerful coalition of allied states. French, Russian, Austrian forces quickly converged on Prussia. Let's pause briefly in our discussion of the war to consider the history of Prussian King Frederick II, also known as Frederick the Great. He became King of Prussia in 1740 at about age 28. For much of his life, he had trained as a soldier. He had visited battlefields. He'd studied politics and history. Frederick believed that everyone was obligated to serve the state. In particular, the king's duty was to increase the power of the state and the standing of the state among its competitors. Frederick had a very strong lust for military glory, and he had many successes throughout his life. He was an authoritative leader. He had an unwavering determination to make Prussia a major European power. He had significant experience with limited war and tactics such as the oblique attack, attrition warfare, and the use of combined arms, so cavalry, infantry, and artillery in war operations. After the War of Austrian Succession ended in 1748, Frederick immediately began preparing his country and army for yet a new war. He wasn't quite sure what that war would be at the time. Frederick strengthened the bureaucracy in the treasury, and he enlarged the army to over 140,000 soldiers. Frederick trained officers to attack in an innovative formation known as the oblique order. This tactic involves overloading forces on one flank to sort of overwhelm the opponent on one side of the front. The goal of this risky maneuver is to create unexpected disarray and rapid defeat of the enemy. The riskiness, of course, is that it could leave the other flank exposed if the enemy realizes what is happening. But because, again, this was a new tactic, although it did draw on some Greek traditions, it was not expected and had significant victories for Frederick. Despite facing much larger armies, Frederick's forces inflicted 22,000 casualties in the Rossbach-Lutten campaign, or about 33% of his opponent's strength, while Prussian forces suffered only 6,400 casualties, or about 18%. So almost a 2-to-1 casualty ratio that worked in his favor. French and Austrian generals were astounded that they had lost so much to these much smaller Prussian forces. Frederick's tactics and battlefield brilliance were the difference in each of these major battles. However, Frederick faced the looming prospect of facing 4 armies from different directions when Sweden joined the war. France from the west, Austria from the south and southwest, Russia from the east, and Sweden from the north, and things were looking rather grim for Frederick. At the time, Frederick's only hope seemed to be to exploit his central position to meet principal enemies separately and prevent them from linking up and joining forces against Prussia. However, at the last minute, Frederick was bailed out by the British, who joined the fight. Their biggest contribution at this point was in providing much-needed funds for Frederick to continue the war on the continent. In addition, Frederick's success was due in part to Britain's ability to defeat the French at sea and in the overseas colonies. The British at the time possessed the world's most powerful fleet. The British relied on the Prussians to do most of the fighting on the continent, and the British, meanwhile, focused on French forces at sea and in the colonies. The British Navy played a number of important roles during the 7 Years' War. First, the British Navy blockaded French ports. These blockading actions bottled up any commerce-raiding vessels the French had. They intercepted French forces that were bound for the colonies, and they prevented a planned invasion of England. British naval vessels also raided the French Atlantic coast. These actions destroyed shipping and stores of military supplies, while diverting French forces, who could have been fighting the Prussians, to protect some of the French ports and French military installations. The British Navy also defeated the French Navy in 3 important engagements, which are depicted on the map here. The first of these was at a French fortress at Louisbourg in the center map, which is located on Cape Breton Island in present-day Nova Scotia. The second major defeat was near the Portuguese port of Lagos. That would be the map on the right, southwestern Portugal. The last was at Quiberon Bay in northwestern France. It was this last naval defeat that destroyed the French plans to invade England. The British, the French, and the Spanish, and to a lesser extent even the Russians, each had significant and extensive colonial interest in North America. This lingering competition was also a contributory factor in the outbreak of war in North America in 1754. The so-called French and Indian War then merged with the 7 Years' War, predating it by 2 years. British Secretary of State William Pitt once said that the Americas were, quote, where England and Europe are to be fought for. Interestingly, Pitt also once said that America was won in Germany, referencing the role of the Prussians in tying up French forces on the continent so they couldn't fight in North America. The British strategy, again, was to let Prussia bear the brunt of fighting in Europe while concentrating British military resources in America and other colonies. The French were ultimately beaten by land forces in North America, but it was the British naval blockade that ended up strangling New France, making the land campaigns much easier. New France never had really been self-sufficient. It was more of a colony of exploitation, particularly in furs. And the French government had to continually provide subsidies throughout the 18th century to keep the colonies afloat. New France was eventually doomed without that regular influx of support from France. The victory in Canada and North America allowed the British to divert thousands of troops and win the war. In short, as a result of the 7 Years' War, the French were defeated in North America. They lost almost all of the North American and Indian subcontinent colonies, and they also lost a significant amount of prestige in Europe. It was almost a total defeat for them, though they were able to not lose any territory in the European continent. Both Austria and France were financially devastated by the 7 Years' War. Prussia was strengthened, gaining territory and establishing its armed forces as some of the most feared in Europe. Russia sort of made a separate side deal to get out of the war. It was an embarrassment for them, but they didn't suffer as deeply financially or in terms of lost territory as did some of the other losers in the war. Britain became even more dominant in global trade as a result of the 7 Years' War, particularly in the crushing defeat of the French Navy. And the rise of the British Empire is generally traced to its victory in this conflict. This is the point at which the British kind of went into sort of hyperdrive. Yet the war left enormous bills to the British, and the question of who would pay for the war remained unanswered at the war's end. Native Americans were very unhappy, in part because some of them had been aligned with the French, in greater measure because many of them distrusted the British based on past history. But the biggest reason was the fact that Native Americans were left out of the peace settlements, and this angered almost all Native American groups. American colonists finally were unhappy, as they believed this was a war they didn't start and for which they should not have to pay taxes. This draws to a close our brief examination of the 7 Years' War.